Hello.
Hello, darling.
How are you?
All the better for seeing your lovely face.
Oh, bless you both. Oh, that's an awesome blanket. I do love that blanket.
And soon it will be finished and I'll actually be able to use it as a blanket and it won't spike me.
Wow.
Being spiked by your blanket is not what you want.
No, not very comfy. Comfortable. Yeah. So how have your days been? Did you catch up on all your sleep? Was it you? Was feeling sleepy, or was it someone else?
I'm usually feeling sleepy. I did do some sleeping. It was good. I like sleeping.
Oh.
How's today been? I made some tasty food.
Yeah. What did you have?
I made some coconut and cardamom fudge.
Oh, sounds amazing.
I mean, it's not really fudge in the sense that you'd think of fudge. It's like an Indian sweet.
All right. Okay.
Does not make it any less tasty.
Sounds good. Cardamom's good.
Cardamom is very good.
How are you, Nick?
All right. Yeah, today's been
good.
Work was good. Like,
really?
I got to spend most of the day focusing on, building the thing that I'm building, which is good. I like long swathes of time where I get to concentrate.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. Get in a zone, focus, get some things out.
Exactly. But then at the end of the day, I've just taken the lead engineer role and
yes.
had a chat with one of the other, the head of the film team we have, and got to hear all the first-hand accounts of how terrible the C-level management are to deal with.
Oh dear.
So I've got all that to look forward to.
Oh goodness. Okay. Have you had any positive feedback from the other thing you applied for?
Didn't get it.
Oh. Well, it's not quite that simple. So what they've said was that for the role that they're looking for right now, I am too senior. They don't want someone with like quite that experience.
Probably because they don't want to pay him that much.
But come March, they are looking to split their teams and create 2 new teams. They think that I would be perfect to lead one of the teams.
Yeah, that's positive. Yeah.
So they are going to get back in touch with me probably sort of, January, February time.
That's really good. Yeah.
Personally, I think this doesn't make any sense, and they should hire him now as a lower level person so he can get to know what's actually happening, and then in March he can start leading the team.
This is why you should be in charge, Katie. Yeah. But that aside, it's a great that's great news, because I've had similar stories from another couple of friends over the past few years, and it's worked out for them, as in they've got the call back a few months later and they've got like the job they wanted.
Yeah.
So I'm really hopeful for you then. That sounds fantastic. Yeah.
What's happened? Also, hello.
Hey.
Hi.
Hello.
You got a bow.
I've got a bow.
You're like a cat.
That was quite convincing.
I mean, she has a real cat. She doesn't just have me meowing at her.
That's true.
Yeah.
Like good source material. Oh.
Is that a real cat though? I don't know.
It's hard to tell when the acting is that good.
Like that, I'm sure a real cat will be here soon.
Willow's going to be outside the door like, what?
Someone's taken my role.
The
like,
fuck
first,
you say?
how dare you? Second.
How are you all? How are you all? Katie, I have a thing for you.
A thing?
I have a thing for you.
I have a thing for you too.
Yeah.
For quite some years.
Nick.
Yeah.
Nicholas. The picture for you.
Wow.
Hold it if I can, please.
It's not
That's
perfect.
Incredible. That's incredible.
It was very nice. It was very nice drawing it. I very much enjoyed looking at your face all afternoon. So thank you very much. What? What?
It was Gordon
What's Gordon doing?
being naughty.
Gordon.
He's hiding small naughty people in his beard.
Gordon. You scamp. You scoundrel.
Oh yeah. Just by the way, I'm very excited about what's happening in the book right now. It's yeah.
I'm so glad you're enjoying it. It's so nice to have you back with us. Also, hello. Who else have we got? Hi, everybody. Hi, Mike. Hi, Nick. Hi, Katie. Hi, Malcolm. Hi, Tal. Hi, Jonathan. Hi,
Hey.
Gordon. Hey, Evan. Hey, Kitty and Rory. Hey, Okay. Hi, Michael. We've got another Michael.
It's like a register. Yes, miss. Yes, miss.
Here's Michael.
I'm sure.
Hey Frankie, for those of us who arrived later though, I arrived just as you said something about having been looking at someone's face and drawing it, and some of us who might not have been here would quite like to see that, I bet.
I drew Katie. Katie sent me 2 exceptionally beautiful pictures of herself after my portrait source material appeal. And one of them was like higher quality and you could zoom in more, but then on the other one she had lots of cleavage, so I drew that one instead.
I can get you a higher res version of that if you want.
I mean, for my files, I probably should have that. But yeah, so I drew that today and had a lovely time.
Oh, exciting.
Tal, are you drawing too?
Yeah, I am.
Ooh, are we allowed to know what you're drawing?
Yeah, but it's a work in progress.
How exciting.
Wow.
Holy shit, dude, look at that.
Ooh.
Wow.
Damn.
That's amazing.
Thank you. I took
So
a
good.
break from it, but I decided to go back to drawing a bit and not succumb to the stress of uni.
Strong
Thank
idea. That's really cool.
Wow.
Everybody's so
Super
cool
impressive.
And having
Thank
things
you.
like drawing is the best way to manage the stress of uni, I think. Like without those kinds of outlets, I wouldn't have managed it.
Yeah.
For sure. Hi, Kim.
Hi.
Hey, Andrada.
Hello.
Hi, Bina. We've got a Bina too. Oh my God, everyone's turned up. We've got a Martin, or possibly have a Martin. Hi, Martin. Wherever he is. Dear me.
What are you making, Bina? Is it still your wedding presents?
Yeah, but I'm very nearly done.
Can we
Good thing.
see?
How exciting. Hi, Martin.
Yeah, I can show you Karen's is finished. Arthur's shorts are finished.
What is this? Just while Bina's away, what's she showing us?
The wedding presents she made for her friends. They're like Japanese pajama things.
Yeah, so this is
With
Karen.
dinosaurs on!
With origami dinosaurs on. So that's like the jacket and the shorts.
That's amazing.
That's
That's adorable.
And then I have the same print, but in boring things that men will wear.
I actually really like the black with white though.
I mean, they both work well. So.
Before you even said that, I thought, oh, that's quite a nice fabric.
Well, I know, but you know what I'm like. You know, like the prints I would choose for myself, and I have to be like, other people do not want to wear like excessively multicolored like unicorn things.
Yeah, we need to turn it down from a 10 down to about a 2 for me. I think.
I do. I just also want to wear angsty looking dinosaurs.
Yeah, but Bina, what are you talking about? You love wearing black. You never wear color or anything cute.
Like, I own a single black jumpsuit, which I bought for a funeral. Like, that's pretty much the extent of like all the black clothes I have.
You're such a like multicolored style icon. You're my multicolored inspo.
Yeah, I feel like I've been doing this for, it's not even like it's taken that long sewing. It's just particularly because I had to like I'd cut out the pattern to my size, so I had to resize the pattern twice. And then like just didn't only just had enough fabric, so I had to do like a whole load of tessellating to make things work, and that fabric has to be the right way up, which makes it like, again, so I feel like I just kept getting to bits that were hard and then not doing it for a while. So I'm quite looking forward to it being finished and in the post, so I can like move on and sew something else.
Hi, Carmen.
I might finish my quilt this week.
Hi, Sean.
Hello.
That's Katie.
Hey, Kitty and Rory.
Hello.
Sean, you were in my dream last night.
Oh, what kind of dream?
I think you were a superhero,
Oh, sweet.
but like a really sexy one.
So like same as normal then.
Yeah,
Whoa!
superheroes famously known for not being sexy at all.
Totally into the Hulk.
There's a really good poem by a poet who I can't remember what their name is, but it's called "What I Learned from the Incredible Hulk." It's very good. Anyone who would like a poem, go and search that out. I highly recommend it. How do you for time, by the way?
Couple of minutes.
That's story time.
Oh, it's story time.
Is it story time? Also, Gordon, I can't believe how long your beard is getting. It's amazing.
It just keeps growing. I don't know what to do with it.
Do that, don't they?
I just want to be Santa.
Great, you're working it. You're working it.
Don't let your dreams be dreams.
This place is so inspirational. Right, everybody. Right, okay. Good to mute you. Now, what have we got? Okay, I think this is all going to be fine. Or is it? Now, are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Dressed in a white wedding gown, her gloved hands folded in her lap, the golem sat on her bed and listened for the step on the stair that meant someone was coming to bring her to her groom. She'd made the gown herself. The high-necked bodice was adorned with lace and embroidery, the waistline shaped by dozens of tiny pin tucks. In the mirror, it seemed almost too delicate for her sturdy frame. Michael, she knew, considered such dresses an impractical extravagance. But she'd sewn it for herself, not him, and she'd worked on it diligently, investing each stitch with her determination to make this arrangement work, to adhere to the path she'd laid for herself. She refused to wear a veil, though. She would go to her wedding with her eyes uncovered. Noises sounded from the parlour below. Men's voices laughing together. It was nearly time. She pressed one hand to her chest, feeling the solid shape of the locket beneath her bodice. Inside it, in place of the lost scrap of paper, there was a folded piece of newsprint. "Dance Hall Attack Mystery," the headline said. She carried it as a reminder of the mistakes she had made and the path she was leaving behind. She'd scoured the papers, but there were no further reports of Irving's condition. She had no idea if he was still alive or if they were still looking for his attacker. Even now, nearly a month later, whenever she went out on the street, she half expected to be arrested. Anna hadn't come back to work again after that night. The Radzins sent little Abby around to her tenement, where the landlady reported that the girl had packed up and left without a word. Mrs. Radzin declared herself worried sick, but Mr. Radzin said he had a business to run, and soon a girl named Ruby was standing behind Anna's table. Ruby was bland and cow-eyed, and would guffaw nervously if anyone so much as looked at her. But she was obedient and spoke little, and for that Mr. Radzin tolerated her. They were downstairs in the parlour now, the Radzins and Ruby, with her landlady and Michael and his small group of friends. "There's no one else you'd like to invite?" Michael had asked. She'd smiled at his concern and shaken her head. For who else was there? No one at all, except for the one man who knew her best. She frowned and smoothed her skirt as though brushing something away. She had to be vigilant now. She could not ruin her chance at a fresh start. She would lock all thoughts of the Djinni away and would not speculate on what he would say about this marriage, if only he knew. The door opened, startling her. A thin, elderly man in a dark suit stood in the doorway. "You must be Mr. Shaw," she said. "Michael has told me so much about you." The old man smiled kindly. "Please," he said, "call me Joseph." She stood and placed a hand on his offered arm. She was taller than him by almost a foot, but even so she felt small and unsure. Would her nerves fail her after all? No. She held herself straighter, firmed her grip, and willed herself to go forward. Together they stepped from her bedroom. Yehuda Shalman led the golem down to the parlour, careful to maintain his composure. It was difficult. He kept wanting to burst into giggles. When Michael Levy had asked him to stand in for the father of the bride, it had taken all of his considerable will to keep a straight face. "If she agrees, then yes, I think that would be appropriate," he'd managed to say. A week earlier, he'd have felt himself the butt of another cosmic joke, but now it was his turn to laugh. The blushing bride, and he'd built her himself. He deposited her next to her betrothed, who stood before the black-robed justice of the peace. The temperature in the parlour was rising, and the younger men, no slaves to decorum, had taken off their jackets. Shalman would have liked to do the same, but he couldn't risk it. His left arm was hampered by a thick bandage below the elbow, and without the jacket it would be far more noticeable, especially if the bandage had started seeping blood again. But his discomfort was a small price to pay. For look at her. Deaf as a post to his thoughts and desires, with no inkling of who he was or what he wanted. His preparations had worked as thoroughly as he'd hoped. Once again, he'd found the answer in his treasured sheaf of papers. After 3 nights of intense study, he'd arrived at the solution. A particular diagram, the sort of thing meant to be inscribed on an amulet and hung about one's neck. But with no amulet at hand and no way of making one, he'd resorted to carving the diagram on the inside of his arm. He hadn't expected it to be a pleasant experience, but still the pain had been shocking in its intensity, as though the knife was reaching beyond his body to slice into his soul. He'd spent the next day sick in bed, arm throbbing, racked with waves of nausea. But it had been so very worth it. Now he'd follow her without detection, and he need not worry if Levy should bring his new house around to the sheltering house unexpectedly. "I will destroy you someday," he thought at the golem, as loudly as he could. But she merely stood there, listening to the sweating justice as he droned on in English. Occasionally, Levy gave his bride a nervous smile. She, on the other hand, looked solemn as an undertaker. Charlemagne tried to what people said of her. A sober woman, he supposed. Quiet, not one for jokes or frivolousness. As though these were traits of her character, like anyone else's, and not the outward signs of her nature, her limitations. It was remarkable that she'd made it this far without being discovered. More fool Levy for falling in love with her. The justice raised his voice in a pronouncement. Charlemagne recognised the words man and wife. And there was a burst of applause and laughter as Levy took the white-clad creature in his arms and kissed her. The justice gave a tight smile and turned away, his job done. Charlemagne laughed along with everyone else, happy in his secret knowledge. It would take another day or so to regain his strength. And then the next phase of his search would begin. Whatever it was that linked the Golem and the Bowery, whatever Levy's uncle had conspired to hide from him, he would uncover it. He could feel the secret out there in the city, waiting patiently to be found. Chapter 21. Mariam, said Arbeli, do you know Nadia Munsef, Matthew's mother? He was sitting at the Fadul's coffee house, drinking cups of scalding coffee despite the heat. Knowing that Arbeli only came when he wished to talk about something, Mariam had kept close to him, polishing the already pristine tables while Saeed attended to the other customers. Now she paused, cloth in hand. Nadia, we've spoken a few times, but not lately. Why do you ask? Arbeli hesitated. He didn't want to say the truth, which was that the woman's face had been haunting him. I went to see her a few weeks ago about Matthew, he said. She was ill. I mean, she looked ill before, but this was different. He went on to describe the woman who'd answered the door. Even thinner than he remembered, her eyes dull and sunken. A strange dark blush, almost a rash, was spread across her cheeks and the bridge of her nose. The crucifix at her throat, 3-barred, the sigil of the Eastern Orthodox, had fluttered visibly in time with her too quick heartbeat. She'd blinked at the feeble light in the hallway as Arbeli haltingly explained his concerns. It wasn't that Matthew was a nuisance, far from it. He was a helpful boy and they enjoyed having him in the shop. But the child was spending mornings there when he should certainly be in a classroom. And if a truancy officer happened to come by, I don't mean to get Matthew in trouble with anyone, he said, including his mother. She'd given him the barest hint of a polite smile. Of course, Mr. Arbeli. I'll speak with Matthew. Thank you for being patient with him. And before Arbeli could protest that patience had nothing to do with it, the boy had real talent and would make a promising apprentice. She went back inside and closed the door, leaving Arbeli to wonder how he could have handled it better. You did what you needed to, Mariam told him. You can't be responsible for her son's welfare. She sighed. Poor Nadia. She's all alone, you know. I was wondering, Arbeli admitted. What happened? Her husband was peddling in Ohio. For a while there were letters, and then nothing. He disappeared? Dead, ill, or run away. No one knows. Arbeli shook his head. It was a common story, but still hard for him to credit. And she has no one here. No family, at least. And she refuses all attempts to help her. I've invited her to dinner, but she never comes. Mariam looked troubled, and no wonder. It wasn't often that someone succeeded in refusing her generosity. I think most of her neighbours have given up trying. Her illness is so strange. It comes and goes. It's terrible to say, but many decided she was making it up to avoid them. Or perhaps she just doesn't want to be stared at and gossiped about. Mariam nodded sadly. You're right, of course. And who can blame her? I'll visit her soon and try again. Perhaps there's some way I can help. Thank you, Mariam. He sighed. At least Matthew stopped coming in the mornings. Although, mind you, some days I'd rather he did. At Mariam's quizzical look, he said, It's Ahmad. At this point, I think he likes the boy more than me. He's been moody lately. A failed love affair, I suspect. He tells me little. Mariam nodded with her usual sympathy, but at the Djinni's name the warmth had faded from her eyes. How was it that Mariam, with her gift for seeing the good in everyone, had taken such dislike to him? Arbili would have liked to ask her, but that, of course, would mean venturing into dangerous territory. Instead, he thanked her and left, feeling more morose than ever. Back at the shop, the Djinni and Matthew were at the Djinni's workbench, their heads bent together like conspirators. The Djinni insisted that Matthew's discovery of his secret had been a complete accident, but still, Arbili felt that the Djinni had been far too cavalier about the whole thing. It had sparked their worst argument since the tin ceiling. How come you didn't hear him come in? Half the time you don't hear him either. Besides, I told you he knew already. And you didn't even try to convince him otherwise? Arbili, he saw me soldering chain links with my bare hands. What could I have said? You could have tried, at least. Made up some lie or other. The Djinni's face had darkened. I'm sick of lying. And when Arbili tried to press the matter, the Djinni had left the shop. Since then, they'd spent most of their mornings in tense silence. But whenever Matthew arrived and took his silent spot on the bench, the Djinni would treat him with uncharacteristic patience. Sometimes they even laughed together at a joke or a mistake, and Arbili would tamp down his jealousy, feeling like a stranger in his own shop. He tried to keep things in perspective. Business was more profitable than ever, and the necklaces they were making for Sam Hosseini were beautiful. No doubt Sam would fetch a small fortune for each. He thought back to the morning the Djinni had come in looking like he'd been dealt a mortal blow. It had been only a month, after all. Hopefully soon his partner would be distracted by something, or, God help them all, someone new and intriguing. The sun dipped behind the broad backs of the tenements, and the light in the shop's high window faded. Women's voices drifted down from the upper stories, calling their children in for supper. Matthew slipped off the bench and was gone, the shop door barely whispering as he passed. Yet again, the Djinni wondered if the spirit world had meddled in the boy's bloodline. It seemed impossible for a human to be that uncanny without help. Matthew's visits had become the sole bright spot in the Djinni's days. Whenever the boy left and the door slipped shut, something would close in himself as well, something barely acknowledged. Arbili would turn up the lamp and they would work in their separate silences until Arbili, succumbing to hunger or fatigue, would heave a sigh and begin to heap sand on the fire. At that, the Djinni would put down his tools and leave, as wordlessly as Matthew. His life was no different than before. The shop during the day, the city at night. But the hours now felt interminable, ruled by a numbing sameness. At night, he walked quickly as though driven to it, barely seeing his surroundings. He tried returning to his old favourites, Madison Square Park, Washington Square, the Battery Park Aquarium, but these places were haunted now, pinned to memories of particular evenings and conversations, things said and unsaid. He could hardly walk within sight of Central Park before a weary anger turned him elsewhere. So he went farther north instead, tracing aimless paths into unexplored territory. He walked up Riverside to Harlem's southern border, then cut through the university's new grounds, past the columned library with its gigantic granite dome. He forged up Amsterdam, crossing streets numbered well into the hundreds. Gradually, the well-kept brownstones gave way to Dutch clapboard houses, their trellises heavy with roses. One night he discovered the Harlem River Speedway and walked its length, the river glittering to his right. It was well past midnight, but a few of society's more reckless specimens were still out in their racing carriages, chasing each other up and down the course. Their horses strained, white-eyed at their bits, kicking up dust from the macadam. At dawn, he found himself in the amusement park at Fort George, its shuttered fairway eerie and silent. The wooden rides seemed skeletal, like the remains of huge abandoned beasts. The 3rd Avenue trolley had its terminus at the park's entrance, and he watched as the day's first car disgorged its passengers. Carnival barkers and ride operators, yawning beer garden girls in faded skirts, an organ grinder whose monkey slept curled around his neck. No one seemed happy to be there. He boarded the car and rode south, watching as the trolley filled and emptied, delivering workers to the factories and printing presses, the sweatshops and the docklands. The more he rode the trolleys and trains of New York, the more they seemed to form a giant, malevolent bellows, inhaling defenseless passengers from platforms and street corners and blowing them out again elsewhere. Back on Washington Street, he trudged to Arbeely's shop, feeling as though he were caught inside a single day that stretched like molten glass. There was nothing to anticipate, except Matthew. He enjoyed the boy's wide-eyed attention, enjoyed giving him tasks and watching him perform them with silent absorption. He supposed that eventually Matthew would grow older and lose interest, and take his place with the feral young men who slouched on the neighborhood stoops. Or, even worse, he'd become just another streetcar rider, dull-eyed and unprotesting. He sat down at his bench without a word of greeting. Behind him, Arbeely puttered around the shop, making irritating humming noises. The man was deep into a large order of kitchen graters and had spent an entire week punching diamond-shaped holes into sheets of tin. Just watching him made the Djinni want to go mad. But Arbeely gave no sign that he minded the repetition, and the Djinni was beginning to detest him for that. "You judge him far too harshly," he could hear the Golem say. He scowled. It was clear they would never speak again, and yet he was hearing her voice more and more often. He rubbed at his cuff, felt the square of paper shift beneath it. Enough. The necklaces were due to Sam Hosseini. He took up his tools and tried to lose himself in the creation of something beautiful. Michael Levy slowly woke to the thin glow of morning. The other half of the bed was an empty sea of sheets and counterpane. He closed his eyes, listened for his wife. There, in the kitchen, bustling about. It was a comforting sound, a childhood sound. The air even smelled of fresh-baked bread. He padded out into the tiny kitchen. She was standing next to the stove in her new house dress, leafing through her American cookbook. He snuck his arms around her waist and kissed her. "Couldn't sleep again?" "Yes, but it's all right." Apparently it was an insomnia she'd had all her life. She said she was used to it, and indeed she looked more awake than he felt. If it were him, he'd be dead on his feet. An amazing woman. He still couldn't believe they were married. At night, he'd lie next to her, tracing his fingers around her stomach, up to her breasts, her arms, amazed at how thoroughly his life had changed. He loved the feel of her skin, always cool somehow, though the days had been sweltering. "I suppose it's because of the ovens at the bakery," he'd said once. "Your body's used to the heat." She smiled as though embarrassed and said, "I think you must be right." She was often shy, his wife. Many of their meals together were silent, or nearly so. They were still tentative with each other, unsure of how to act. He'd look across the table and wonder, had they married too quickly? Would they always be strangers to each other? But then, even before the thought had passed from his mind, she would ask about his day, or tell him a story from hers, or else simply reach across and squeeze his hand. He would realise it was exactly what he'd needed, and wonder how she'd know. Then there was the matter of the bedroom. Their wedding night had begun tentatively. He was well aware that as a previously married woman, she would be much more experienced than he. But what did she like? What pleased her? He had no idea how to ask, and not nearly enough nerve. What if she suggested something outlandish, even terrifying? His friends, when they'd had a few drinks, boasted of their exotic nights with emancipated girls, but his own fantasies had never ventured far from the prosaic. Perhaps it was a failing. Perhaps she'd be disappointed. If she was, she didn't say so. Seeming to understand his distress, and there again was that knowing, she had led him into the act with her usual calm and steady demeanour. If their lovemaking was a little too workmanlike, if afterward he'd been unsure of her own pleasure, still he was relieved that it had been accomplished at all. And then there'd been the night a week or so later, when she'd started as though surprised and placed a hand between their bodies, pressing at a particular spot. To Michael's utter regret, he'd frozen, chagrined, as his orthodox upbringing rushed clamouring to the fore, insisting that this was immodest, unbecoming in a wife. And slowly she'd removed her hand and replaced it on his back and resumed their rhythm. He couldn't talk to her about it later. He just couldn't. He tried once to repeat what she herself had done, but she took his hand and moved it away, and that had been that. Already there were things unsaid between them. But he loved her. He was certain of it. And he liked to think she loved him in return. He imagined them in 30 years, with children grown, holding hands in bed and laughing at how unsure they'd been, how delicately they'd tiptoed around each other. "But you always knew just what to say," he'd tell her, and she would smile and nestle her head in his shoulder, both of them completely at home. He'd ask her about these things someday. He'd find out what had prompted her to propose to him just when he'd given up hope, or what she'd been thinking as she stood next to him before the justice of the peace, looking so composed and serene. He only hoped it wouldn't take him 30 years to ask. The Golem placed a glass of tea and a plate of bread before her husband and watched as he ate quickly in big bites. She smiled in real fondness. He was so earnest in everything he did. She turned back to the sink to clean the few remaining dishes. They lived now in 3 tiny rooms crammed at the end of a first-floor hallway. The thin light that filtered down the air shaft illuminated a pile of garbage that climbed halfway up the bedroom window. Sometimes she'd watch as a cigarette butt floated down from above. The kitchen was more like a closet, with a stove barely big enough to roast a chicken. At night she did her sewing in the parlour, which hardly merited the name. It was perhaps a third the size of her old room at the boarding house. The room's main advantage was that they sat at the back of the tenement, which had been dug into a slight rise, so that the earth kept them cool while the rest of the building sweltered. "It'll be warmer in winter too," Michael had said. She hoped this meant she wouldn't feel so stiff and creaky, so driven to walk in the evenings. But deep down, she knew that her proximity to Michael's restless mind would hound her to distraction as surely as the weather once had. Within days of their marriage, she'd realised how much she'd underestimated the difficulty ahead. Unlike the rabbi, who'd been so circumspect, so careful in his thoughts, Michael's mind was a constant churn of wants and fears and second guesses, most of them directed at herself. The noise wore down her composure and tested her self-control. She found herself serving him second helpings when he was hungry, talking when he wanted conversation, taking his hand when he needed reassurance. She'd begun to wonder whether she still had a will of her own. Also, there were the endless practical dilemmas. The long stretches of lying next to him in bed, remembering to breathe in and out. The excuses for her sleeplessness, her cool skin. Would he notice that her hair never grew? Or, God forbid, that she had no heartbeat? And what would happen when she failed to bear children? She'd hoped to keep marital relations to a minimum, to put some protective distance between them. She was afraid, above all, of hurting him accidentally. But then his desire would grow too strong to ignore, and she would feel driven to respond, or else lie there frustrated by reflected lust. There'd been that one night when she'd felt her own warm tingle of desire and tried eagerly to encourage it. But it had been doused by Michael's awkward, guilty horror. It wasn't his fault. She could feel his chagrin at his reaction, and he'd later tried to remedy the situation, but with such tortured ambivalence that she'd put an end to the attempt. Was it the pleasure itself, she wondered, that was somehow shameful, or only what she'd done to increase it? Unbidden, she heard the Djinni say, "It should be easy. They're the ones who complicate it beyond reason." No, she couldn't afford to listen to that voice. It was wrong, ludicrous even, to resent Michael for her decision. She'd bound herself to him. She would see through what she'd begun. And perhaps, one day, she would tell him the truth. At last, the necklaces for Sam Hosseini were finished. Arbili delivered them to Sam's shop himself, not trusting the Djinni to strike a good bargain. But he needn't have worried, for Sam was so pleased with them that he barely remembered to haggle. Besides the Djinni's original necklace, with its discs of blue-green glass, there were versions with garnet-coloured teardrops, brilliant white crystals, and lozenges of a deep emerald green. The Djinni had flattened the links and added the faintest edge of tarnish to the metal, which gave them a timeless beauty, while also looking like nothing Sam had ever seen. Arbili had expected Sam to display the necklaces in his largest glass case, but Sam had a better plan. Lately, it had become fashionable for Manhattan's society women to pose for portraits while dressed in a fanciful Oriental style, such as they imagined a Near Eastern princess or courtesan might have worn. Sam's shop was a popular destination for these ladies, who often sent their maids or even came themselves to buy props and costume pieces. Most of them viewed bargaining as gauche, which meant that Sam was turning a tidy profit in curl-toed slippers, billowing silk trousers, and faux Egyptian armbands. The new necklaces would certainly appeal to them, and Sam knew they would like them even better if they came with a story. It was only a few days before the first likely customer arrived. A sleek, expensive brougham pulled up in front of Sam's shop, causing a good deal of gawking from the passers-by, and a dark-haired young woman emerged. The afternoon heat was baking the sidewalks, but the young woman wore a heavy, dark dress and a thick shawl. She looked about with polite curiosity until an older woman, dressed just as finely in black, stepped from a carriage. The older woman eyed their surroundings with distaste, then took hold of her companion's elbow and led her swiftly into Sam's shop. They were indeed there for a portrait. My fiancé's idea, said the young woman. He commissioned it as a wedding present. Sam ushered them to his best chairs, poured them tea, and spent the next hour bringing them bolts of fabric, beaded scarves, veils hung with coins, and whatever other bric-a-brac he thought they might fancy. Surprisingly, the young woman had a good eye for authenticity and avoided the gaudiest offerings. Soon she'd put together an outfit that truly resembled what an Ottoman woman of means might once have worn. The sun slanted through the shop's large windows, and the old woman dabbed at her brow with her handkerchief. But the young woman made no move to unwrap her shawl, and Sam noticed that the teacup shook slightly in her hand. Some sort of illness or palsy, perhaps. A shame in one so young and lovely. Eventually, as Sam had predicted, they arrived at the subject of a proper necklace. He went into the storeroom and emerged with an old leather box, battered and worn, and blew imaginary dust from its top. This, he said, I rarely show. He opened the box, and the young woman gasped as he took out necklace after necklace. How gorgeous! Are they antiques? Yes, very old. They belong to my Jada. Excuse me, how do you say? Mother of mother? Grandmother. Yes, thank you, my grandmother. She was Bedouin. You know this? A traveller in the desert. Yes, I've heard of the Bedouin, said the young woman. My grandfather gives them to her at their wedding, a part of her... price? Her dowry. Yes, dowry. When she dies, she leaves me the necklaces to sell. For a beautiful necklace must have a beautiful woman to wear, or else it is worth nothing at all. You wouldn't rather keep them for your own wife or your children? For them, and he gestured to the shop around them, I make a business, much more valuable in America. She chuckled. You're a wise man, Mr. Hosseini. Next to her, the old woman sniffed, as though to express her opinion of Mr. Hosseini's wisdom, or perhaps the entire conversation. May I see this one? And the young woman pointed to the necklace with discs of blue-green glass. He fetched a hand mirror and held it up while her older companion fastened the clasp. She gazed at herself, and Sam smiled. The necklace fit as though made for her throat. Beautiful, he said, like a queen of the desert. With her shaking fingers, she reached up and touched the necklace. The glass discs shifted, chiming softly against each other. A queen of the desert, she echoed. And then a deep and startling sadness crept over her face. Tears began to spill from her eyes. She covered them with a hand and drew her breath in a hitching sob. My dear, what's the matter? Cried the old woman. But her young companion just shook her head, trying to smile, obviously embarrassed at herself. Sam fetched her a handkerchief, which she took gratefully and dabbed at her eyes. Chagrined, he could not refrain from blurting out, You don't like it? Oh, no, I like it very much. I'm so sorry, Mr. Hosseini. I'm just not myself at the moment. It's the wedding, said the older woman consolingly. Your mother makes such a fuss of everything. I wonder how you can bear it. Sam nodded at this, thinking of his own quiet Lulu, her lingering homesickness. A wedding is a strange time, he said. Much happiness, but many changes also. There certainly are. The young woman took a deep breath and then smiled at her reflection. It's beautiful. What will you take for it? Sam named a number he thought slightly less than ludicrous, and she readily agreed. The old woman's eyes widened with alarm, and she looked as though she would have given her charge a stern chiding if they'd been alone. Sensing that the shopping was now concluded, Sam poured them more tea and brought out small cakes dusted with crushed pistachios. My wife makes these, he announced proudly, and busied himself with wrapping their parcels and carrying them to the waiting carriage. The footman gave him an address on Fifth Avenue where he could send a bill. When the women finally rose to leave, Sam placed his hand on his heart and bowed to both of them. Your visit honours me, he said. If you need anything else, please come again. I will, the young woman said warmly, and clasped his hand. He felt the odd tremor in her fingers. She glanced at her companion, who was already making her way toward the door, and lowered her voice. Mr. Hosseini, do you know many of your Syrian neighbours? Yes, he said, surprised. I am here a long time. I know everyone. Then, could you tell me, do you know a man? But then she looked again to the woman waiting nearby at the door, and whatever question she meant to ask died on her lips. She smiled again, a bit sadly, and said, It's no matter. Thank you, Mr. Hosseini, for everything. The bells on the door jangled as she passed. The footman helped Sophia into the carriage. She settled herself next to her aunt and pulled her shawl a bit tighter. The trip had been a success. She only wished she had not cried like that and made a spectacle of herself. She supposed she ought to thank her aunt for providing an excuse for her tears, when their true cause had been far different. A queen of the desert. That was what she'd imagined herself, in her bed, in his arms. Suffice to say, the irony of her engagement portrait had not been lost on her. Her perspiring aunt fanned herself with her gloves. She turned to Sophia as though to say something, this terrible heat, but then caught herself and only gave her a strained smile. Sophia's illness had this benefit, at least. Her acquaintance's newfound awkwardness meant a reprieve from all sorts of chit-chat. The footman nudged the brougham away from the curb and threaded slowly through the morass of carts. Shall we go to Central Park? Her aunt said. I'm sure your mother wouldn't mind. That's all right, Auntie. I'd rather just go home. She smiled to soften the refusal. Her aunt was worried about her. They all were. Sophia had never been an energetic girl, but at least she had gone for walks and visited friends and done the things a wealthy young woman was supposed to do. Now she merely sat by the fire for hours at a stretch. She knew they all pitied her, but she'd found a real comfort in her protracted convalescence. Her mother had excused her from all social functions, which were few in any case, as the Winstons were the only family of note who still lingered in the city. Her father, indulgent in his concern, had opened his library to her, and at last she could read to her heart's content. In all, these last few weeks had been some of the most peaceable of her life. She had the sense of existing inside a fragile pause, a moment of grace. But that would soon be over. Her mother was determined to forge ahead with the wedding plans. She'd even told her fiancé's parents that Sophia's tremor was improving, which was certainly not the case. Sophia had merely learned to disguise it more effectively. As for Charles himself, so far he'd taken care to appear undeterred by the sight of his shivering fiancée. At each meeting he asked once after her health. Always she struggled to find an answer that was neither a falsehood nor a complaint. and then embarked on a rapid stream of pleasantries. It was exactly the sort of conversation she'd hoped never to have with her husband, and she doubted he relished it either. She feared their married life would be like some dreadful novel, the dissatisfied young husband, the sickly heiress. She watched the men and women going about their business outside the hansom window and wondered what it would be like to lose herself among them, the warm press of people carrying her somewhere else, somewhere far away. And then she saw him. The tinsmith's shop had felt especially stifling that morning. Each thud of Arbeely's hammer, each dull ring of metal on metal seemed pitched and calculated to be as annoying as possible. So when Arbeely grumbled that the hammer's rawhide was wearing thin, the Djinni declared he would go to the tack and harness shop on Clarkson and buy him a piece. It was a long walk for a minor errand, but Arbeely had given him no argument. Apparently both of them wanted him gone. They'd fought again, bitterly, over Matthew this time. Arbeely had learned that the boy had no father to speak of, and seemed to think the Djinni should be concerned about the boy's welfare. The ensuing argument had included phrases such as moral guidance and appropriate father figure, and other impenetrables that the Djinni suspected were tinged with insult. What business was it of Arbeely's if Matthew chose to spend the afternoons with him? The truth, the Djinni sensed, was that Arbeely was jealous. Matthew paid him hardly any attention, though he obeyed without protest whenever Arbeely pointed out the lateness of the hour, saying, "Your mother will be worried." But it was on the Djinni's bench that the boy silently materialised every afternoon. And no wonder. Who'd want to spend their afternoons with Arbeely if they could avoid it? With each day, the tinsmith became more of a misery, his brow furrowing with worry and disapproval, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep. "You look terrible," the Djinni told him one morning, and in return the man shot him a look of surprising hostility. He left the shop, his thoughts in their now usual stew, and crossed the street, navigating with irritation the carts and horses. Many of them had been held up behind a hansom that was trying to pull away from the curb. The hansom inched forward, and the Djinni glanced into the window as he passed. It was, unmistakably, Sophia, and yet he had to look again. Pallid, black-wrapped, she had clearly undergone some terrible change. Again he remembered her dark and shrouded room. What had happened to her? Was the girl ill? She looked up and saw him. Surprise, dismay, anger all passed across her features. But she did not flush or glance away, as once she would have. Instead, she held his gaze and gave him a look of such naked, vulnerable sadness that it was he who glanced away first. In the next moment, the cab passed. Confused, shaken, the Djinni continued on his way. He told himself she was a girl of means, and that her problem, whatever it was not his to solve. But he could not let go of the feeling that, in that moment, she had been calling him to account for something. Abu Yusuf sat on the floor of the sick tent, holding his daughter's hand. 3 days had passed since Fadwa had taken ill, and in that time he had barely moved from her side. He watched Fadwa's dreaming fingers grasp at air, listened to her moan and mutter nonsense. At first they'd coaxed her to open her eyes, but the girl had taken one look at Abu Yusuf, screamed in terror and begun to choke. After that, they'd blindfolded her tightly with a dark rag. The word "possessed" hung in the close air of the sick tent, was exchanged in every glance, but not a tongue uttered it. Abu Yusuf's brothers shouldered his duties without a word. Fatim stuck to her work, muttering that someone had to keep them fed. It would do Fadwa no good if they all starved. Every few hours she took a bowl of thinned yogurt into the sick tent and spooned as much of it as she could into her daughter's mouth. Her eyes were red-rimmed as she worked, and she said little, only glanced at her husband as he sat there, silently blaming himself. He should have raised an alarm, he'd decided, when he'd glimpsed that impossible palace. He should have taken his daughter and ridden far, far away. By the end of the second day, Fatim's glances had a touch of accusation about them. How long, she seemed to be saying, will you sit here doing nothing? Why do you let her suffer when you know the remedy? And an unspoken name rose to float between them. Wahab ibn Malik. He wanted to argue with her, to tell her that prudence dictated he wait and see if Fadwa improved before he travelled that path, that he had had no idea if Ibn Malik was even still alive. But on the morning of the third day, he had to admit that she was right. Fadwa was not improving, and his prudence was beginning to seem like cowardice. Enough, he said, standing. Tell my brothers to ready a horse and a pony, and bring me one of the ewes. She nodded, grimly satisfied, and left the tent. He packed a week's worth of provisions, then placed Fadwa on the pony, bound her hands and tied her into the saddle. Her blindfolded head dipped and jerked, like a man falling asleep on watch. He tethered the ewe to Fadwa's pony, giving it plenty of lead. Then he mounted his horse and took the pony's reins and led them out of the encampment, a pitiful, half-blind procession. No one gathered to see them off. Instead, the clan peered out from tent corners and door flaps and mouthed silent prayers for their safe return and for protection against the very man they sought. Only Fatim stood in the open, watching her husband until her husband and daughter disappeared. Ibn Malik's cave lay in the western hills on a rocky, wind-buffeted slope. Few of the clan ever ventured that way, for there was no grazing, no place for an encampment. Already when Abu Yusuf was a boy, and not yet called Abu Yusuf, only Jalal ibn Karim, to travel west had become a euphemism among the clan for seeking out Wahab ibn Malik. Parents travelled west with children who were gravely ill or in need of exorcisms. Barren wives travelled west with their husbands and soon quickened with child. But always Ibn Malik took something in return, either from the healed or from the ones who'd brought them. Not just a sheep or two, but something intangible and necessary. The father of the exorcised child never spoke again. The pregnant woman was struck blind during the birth. No one exclaimed at the losses, for these were debts paid to Ibn Malik, and everyone knew it. Abu Yusuf's own cousin Aziz had once paid such a debt. Aziz was 9 years older than young Jalal, and strong and tall and handsome. All the men of the clan could sit a horse as though born in the saddle, but Aziz rode like a god, and Jalal worshipped him for it. Jalal had been out tending his father's sheep when Aziz's horse stumbled in a hole and threw his rider, breaking the young man's back and neck. Aziz lingered between life and death for a day before his father decided to travel west. There was no way to drag a litter up the rocky hillsides, so he made the trip alone and returned carrying a sack of poultices. At their touch, Aziz's bones healed and his fever disappeared. Within a week, he was up and walking. But from then on, every horse he approached shied at the sight of him. The few he managed to touch would scream in terror and foam at the mouth. Aziz al-Hadid, master of horses, never rode again. He became a shadow of his former self, but still, at least he had lived. Slowly, they made their way west. Every few hours, Abu Yusuf would tilt a water skin to Fadwa's lips or feed her a few mouthfuls of yogurt. Sometimes she spat it out. Sometimes she gulped it down as though starving. Soon the flat terrain of the steppes gave way to angled hills and low, jagged peaks. It was hard going, and the ewe started to struggle. When it became clear she couldn't go on much farther, Abu Yusuf dismounted, kneeled on the struggling animal's side, and bashed her skull in with a rock. She'd have to be drained soon, or her blood would turn to poison. But if he did it there, he'd bring down every jackal in the hills. He lashed the carcass to his horse's back, and they continued on. It was almost evening when Ibn Malik's cave came into sight. Squinting against the last of the sun, Abu Yusuf spied a small, thin figure sitting cross-legged on the flat apron of rock just outside its entrance. He was alive, and he'd known they were coming. Of course he'd know. Wahab ibn Malik had been already in his 30s when Abu Yusuf's cousin was injured. But even so, as they drew closer, Abu Yusuf found himself shocked at the state of the man who waited for them. He seemed no more than a leathered, yellow-eyed skeleton. He stood as they approached, a spider-like unfolding, and Abu Yusuf saw that he was naked apart from a torn loincloth. He glanced back at Fadwa, but of course the girl was blindfolded and could see nothing. He dismounted and untied the dead ewe from Fadwa's horse. Cradling it in his arms, he approached Ibn Malik and laid it at his feet. The man grinned at Abu Yusuf, revealing dark, broken teeth, and looked over at Fadwa, still tied to her pony. "You want an exorcism," Ibn Malik said. His voice was startling. Deep and full, it seemed to come from somewhere other than his body. "Yes," said Abu Yusuf uneasily, "if you think there's hope." Ibn Malik laughed. "There is never hope, Jalal ibn Karim," he said. "There's only what can be done and what cannot." He nodded at Fadwa. "Bring her down from there and follow me. And then we will see what can be done." With that, he bent and lifted two of the dead ew's legs and dragged her into the mouth of the cave. What Abu Yusuf had taken to be a small cave was only the first of a series of linked, torch-lit recesses that stretched deep into the cliff. As he followed Ibn Malik, Fadwa muttered and twisted in his arms, trying to get away from something only she could see. The guttering torches smelled of animal fat and spat out a greasy black smoke that filled the passageways. In one of the smaller caves, Ibn Malik gestured for him to place Fadwa on a rude pallet. Abu Yusuf did so, trying to ignore the general filth of the place, and watched helplessly as Ibn Malik started his examination. Fadwa struggled against the man until he poured something in her mouth that made her relax and go still. Then he began to strip her clothing away. His demeanour was entirely dispassionate. Still, Abu Yusuf wanted to drag him away from her side and bash in his head as he'd done to the ewe. "Only her mind was violated, not her body," Ibn Malik said at length. "You'll be pleased to hear she's still a virgin." A wash of red passed over Abu Yusuf's eyes. "Get on with it," he muttered. Ibn Malik removed the blindfold and opened one of her eyes, and then another. Abu Yusuf cringed, waiting for her to cry out or vomit, but she lay silent and still. "Interesting," Ibn Malik said, almost in a purr. What is it? The skeletal man made a shushing gesture so absurdly like Fatim's that Abu Yusuf wanted to laugh. The impulse died as Ibn Malik suddenly moved to straddle Fadwa. With both hands, he peeled her eyelids back. His dirty forehead came down to touch hers. For long minutes, they stared deep into each other's eyes. Neither of them blinked, nor seemed even to breathe. Abu Yusuf turned around, not wanting to see Ibn Malik squatting over his daughter's chest like a grotesque insect. The torchlight filled his nose and clotted his lungs, making him dizzy. He leaned against the rough wall and closed his eyes. After some time, he didn't know how long, he heard movement and turned to see Ibn Malik rising from his daughter's side. The ancient man was smiling, his eyes lit like a boy's with excitement. I've been waiting for this, Ibn Malik said, all my life. Can you heal her? Abu Yusuf asked dully. Yes, it's easy, the man said with impatience. But, as Abu Yusuf sagged at the knees, tears springing to his eyes, not yet. No, not yet. There's something larger here. I must consider carefully. We need a plan, a strategy. A strategy for what? Ibn Malik flashed his broken grin. For capturing the Djinni that did this to your daughter.
Oh no!
Oh no!
What's gonna happen?
Oh shit!
Oh shit!
He's so disgusting.
Isn't he awful? Gross, 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 gross.
Can we go back to the stories without men in?
Yes. Well, I mean, we have Feet of Clay next, which is, you know, female and clay heavy, at least.
It's not really female.
Can we get back
heavy.
to the ones that have better female leads?
We will. Don't you fret now.
I like
Don't
the
you
female
fret
leads of
now.
this.
I
She's
like her.
grating on me so much.
Where's Sophia?
Oh no!
on-
What do you not? Why do you not like her?
So, well, because she goes and blames the Djinni, like, oh, you're tempting me and I've done all these bad things because of you, bloody, 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 blah, right? And then comes this chapter and she gets married and she hears all the thoughts of her husband, Michael, and she's like, oh, but I can't blame him for this. This was my choice. It's like, they were all your fucking choices, woman.
But also, to be clear, Djinni is a fuckboy who doesn't check in afterwards. He just kind of boosts. And, like, that seems to be what's happened with Fadwa as well. Like, I'm hoping he learns something about, like, you know, maintaining connections with people, but who knows?
Who knows? Who knows? Tune in tomorrow to find out, and also the day after.
To defend Chava there, right?
What was
I
that?
think that to defend Chava, like just a second, she did like start getting blamey with the Djinni, and then was like, no, I did do these things. It was your influence that opened me up to the ideas that led me to these choices. Was more what I got from her than like straight up blaming him after she'd calmed down a little bit. Yeah. I think it's natural to get blamey and then be like, oh wait, no, wait,
Yeah.
these are choices.
I found that like as quite an unreasonable person, I found that very relatable, that she was like, you know, oh no, I fucked up, I've done something, oh, this is your fault. Like I think that's quite a kind of like quite a human impulse to sort of slightly like be inclined to blame the other person for something that is like demonstrably not their fault, just because you're like frustrated and annoyed and you have all of this blame and you don't necessarily want to put it where it belongs, i.e. on yourself.
But also, calling Djinni a fuckboy, he's not like marrying someone who's deeply in love with him in order to like make their life miserable.
No, agreed. But also, he's like, I don't know, he's leaving a trail of pretty materially harmed women in his wake.
Yeah, I like for sure. But also, Chava is like using Michael. Like she's not using him like for sex, but like she has a desire and a need. She has an end in mind, and she's using Michael as like a convenient way to get that met. Like she hasn't married him because I like
no, like the Djinni is like conveniently ignorant of the consequences of his action.
Yeah, I was going to put that down to weird cultural differences. Would you say that?
Between the Djinni world and ours.
But Hava is like very, very aware of what she's doing. And I'm not saying one's better than and one's worse. I'm saying that.
Is she though? Like she's never seen a good relationship.
I'm definitely not like blaming her. I'm just like, I don't think it's a case that like Djinni is this like terrible character and Chava is this like saint. Like they're both fucking shit up inadvertently or like carelessly or whatever in their own ways.
They're both self-involved and like lacking somewhat in care for the people around them.
They're both human.
Yeah, and like Chava's interesting, right? I totally agree. I don't think she's like the good one or anything, but yeah, it's this weird thing where she's super like on one level she's absolutely catering to the needs of this guy and like vanishing into that selflessness role and things and looking after him. But
the amount of emotional labor there
and stuff, and like I don't know if anyone else has relatable experiences as far as this, but yeah, like it's really well written, the marriage, and it's killing me.
Yeah. Yep. High five.
Yep.
Yes.
I really can't believe she actually married him. I thought she would just like, should ask him and he'll be like, yeah, but something will happen, and she wouldn't do it. So I'm still coping with that. She actually went with it, and I'm not happy at all. But I actually need to go now, but I'll leave you with napping Suki.
Fluff ball.
Just
oh my god,
just for the catch-up crew. So yeah, I know it's hard, but cat. So
the catch-up crew.
Oh.
Bye.
Bye.
Good to see you.
Yeah. The whole bit, that whole like passage where like Michael is like talking about their marriage and stuff, and I was just oh god, that was like too real. Why would you come for us like this, Helene? Bad times.
A side comment. I'm really sad that Anna's no longer in this. Well, she seems to have disappeared from the plot line.
Well, yeah, she's married. She doesn't have a job anymore.
Is she married there?
No, because her alleged fiance is like
fiance, and then
Golem's married. Yeah, but Golem's not going to meet Anna anymore because she doesn't have a job because she's married.
does the Golem not work at the bakery anymore?
No, she left and disappeared.
Anna left.
No, Anna left.
But the Golem still works at the bakery.
I don't think so.
Yeah, because the other girl came in and the Golem knows.
Yeah, Ruby appeared and they were chatting.
Presumably it will all become clear in future chapters.
I don't know, Frankie, will it?
I don't know, Katie. Will it? Yeah, touche. How'd you like them apples? Oh, wait. We should say goodbye to the catch-up crew.
Can we give an extra shout out to Lisa? Extra hug.
Shout out to Lisa. Shout out to Lisa and Jonas.
Whisper.
Michael, you're not hugging Lisa and Jonas. Martin, even. Come on.
I'm hugging the best I can.
Martin. There we go. You get called out because you're on my screen, so I could see you. I could see you not hugging. Right. Goodbye, catch-up crew. Goodbye.